Biology 1441 focuses on evolution, ecology, and diversity of life. And so we've talked a bit about animal physiology. We had a virtual lab on plant physiology. Now we're going to talk a little bit about plant reproduction and diversity. So the reason we're focusing on reproduction is you can tell various kinds of plants apart from one another because of the way they reproduce, their adaptations. So the ways they reproduce are adaptations to life on land because they come from algal ancestors that didn't have to cope with life on land. Now they've evolved to life on land and they have to find ways to reproduce, to get nutrients to all their parts, etc. So they have lots of adaptations. So here are some of the basic goals for the lab this week. Now, if we were to fill out a data matrix to make a cladogram of green algae, which is our outgroup, moss, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So gymnosperms are plants like conifers. They have cones. They don't have fruits or flowers, but they have seed cones a lot of times. Angiosperms are the flowering plants. All land plants, including mosses, have protected embryos. You can't live on land and have your embryo just lying there in the sun. It dries out and dies. So if we were to fill this entire table out with the correct zeros and ones, we could end up with a cladogram that looks something like this. So the mosses, and I don't have the algae on here. Algae would be down here, then protected embryo, then mosses. Vascular tissue, that's xylem and phloem. Those are the tissues that carry water and nutrients throughout the plant, appear before the ferns, and seeds evolve after the ferns and are found in pine trees, which are a type of conifer. There's lots of other kinds of gymnosperms, of course, like ginkgo is a gymnosperm, for example. Cedar trees, giant redwood trees, those are all different kinds of gymnosperms. Flowers evolve after that, and that's what unites the flowering plants, the most diverse group of plants. Now, the weird thing about the plant life cycle is that there are two multicellular stages, meaning two different life forms that are multicellular that have a job to do. One of them makes spores, and a spore is just a cell that's haploid. It falls on the ground and it grows into a new plant. The gametophyte is a plant that makes gametes. So whenever you see the word phyte at the end of something, phyte means plant. So sporophyte is a spore-making plant, makes spores via meiosis. Gametophyte is a gamete-making plant. It makes spores via mitosis. So here's the basic life cycle then. We have gametophytes making gametes, which make a zygote, which makes a sporophyte back to spores. Of course, before, if you were in lab, before you would do this slide, see this slide, you would have kind of mapped this out on your own using the lab handout. So gametophytes, which are this part of the life cycle, so if you would flip back to this image or one in your book as you learn about this, gametophytes come in different sizes and shapes depending where you are on the cladogram. If you're at the bottom of the cladogram, like on mosses, gametophytes are the great big green leafy thing. These are haploid plants, so they're haploid. So see, they're on the end side of this life cycle. The two-end part, the only part of this whole life cycle that's diploid is the sporophyte, okay? So gametophytes are haploid. So moss gametophytes are haploid. These other things are gametophytes as well. This is the gametophyte of a fern. It's small. It's about the size of your pinky nail or your thumbnail at the most. These are pollen grains. These are pine nuts inside of a seed. Those are female gametophytes. And this is the gametophyte of a flowering plant. It's only 7 cells big inside of the seed here. So gametophytes get smaller as we move up the cladogram. Now, like I said, in mosses they're big, in ferns they're smaller, and in flowering plants, gametophytes are tiny. Gametophytes get smaller as you go up. The opposite is true for sporophytes. Sporophytes in a moss are just these little capsules, these little sporangia that make spores, and then they die. But when you look at an oak tree or a pine tree or a fern, that big green thing that you see is the sporophyte. It's the spore-making plant, the plant that makes spores. So you're going to go outside and find some moss growing. You're going to bring back some sporophytes, and you're going to make a wet mount and look at those under the microscope. So here's the basic moss life cycle. You can compare this to that basic plant life cycle. It's the same life cycle basically, with a few more parts shown here. Here are spores. They're haploid. They grow into gametophytes. Gametophytes have two structures on them. One's called an antheridium. Antheridium, or antheridia, is the singular word. Antheridium is singular. Antheridia is plural. Antheridia make sperm by mitosis. This is called an archegonium. It makes eggs by mitosis. It has a long neck on it, and sperm in moss have to swim down that neck. So they have to swim by flagella to the egg to fertilize it, making a zygote, which grows up to be a sporophyte. That sporophyte grows right out of the archegonium, makes spores, and then dies. And that's how a moss spreads itself around. So in the case of sporophytes, they're really small. They don't live very long. They're actually not independent in the mosses, meaning that they depend on the gametophyte for food. But as we move up to larger and larger trees, the sporophytes become independent and they get larger. So what I mean by they depend on the gametophyte for food is they're plugged into it. They don't have their own. They don't really photosynthesize much on their own. They can't get their own water. They depend totally on the gametophyte that they're growing out of in the mosses. But in these plants, in the ferns and the seed plants, they're much larger and independent. All right, so after you've seen your moss spores, then you're going to go take a sorus off the bottom of a fern leaf. A sorus is a collection of sporangia. So this one sporangium right here is homologous to one of these little round things right here, okay? This is a collection of sporangia, which means spore house, basically, spore-making structures. And they are found often on the bottom of fern leaves. They have a structure called an annulus on top that kind of looks like a worm. And you can see here that when that annulus dries out, it collapses, the cells collapse, and it stretches out, and it then flings the spores out into the environment. There are videos of how this works on YouTube if you want to check it out. But each one of these structures has lots of spores inside produced by meiosis. And they fall on the ground and grow into fern gametophytes, which are smaller than moss gametophytes, but they still contain archegonia and antheridia. And you can look at those on a slide as well. Archegonia have necks. The necks on our slides won't look this long. They're kind of stubby, but you will be able to see them under the microscope pretty readily, I think. And then these structures here are antheridia, which are the structures that make sperm. Those little dots inside are sperm in development. And once again, ferns have vascular tissue. They have xylem and phloem, but they still have to have water for reproduction. Now we cross into seed plants. Seed plants evolve later in the Paleozoic era, back in the day, and they are well adapted to life on land. They have roots and leaves like the ferns do. They have vascular tissue like the ferns do. But now they no longer need water to have sex. Why? Because they've eliminated swimming sperm from their reproductive cycle. Instead, once again, let me rehash that the gametophytes get smaller as you get closer to seed plants. So the female gametophyte is inside the ovule. The word ovule confuses students. Ovule in this case is the seed, the developing seed. And inside of that developing seed is the gametophyte that makes the egg. So the egg of the plant is inside the seed, inside the ovule, okay? The male gametophyte is pollen grain, and what it is, it's only a few cells big, has, in this case, two cells, one called the generative nucleus and one called the pollen tube nucleus. The generative nucleus divides by mitosis to make two sperm, and the pollen tube cell grows into a big tube that delivers the sperm to the egg without the sperm having to swim. Also, pollen grains contain lots of proteins in their outer structures to help them to help with cell identification and things when they land on the right kind of flower. And for whatever reason, a lot of us react to those proteins when they get in our nose, and we think that they are invading pathogens. Thank you. Thank you, pollen. So basically, pollen grains are like sperm airplanes. They have 2 sperm inside. They fly through the air. They have this protective outer coating that keeps them safe and dry until they land on the right kind of plant. So we're going to use conifers as our example. Gymnosperm, bear in mind, they produce 2 kinds of cones. Seed cones, female cones, which produce ovules, which are seeds. And remember, seeds are basically a protective outer covering with what's inside. I'm not going to make you learn this word here, but inside you're going to eventually have your female gametophyte, which makes an egg, and then pollen grains are going to land on this cone. They get blown around in the wind. They land on the cone, and their pollen tube grows, and their sperm are released to the egg, and then we get a zygote formed from that inside the seed. And eventually the seeds form, and they lay on those scales of the cone, and they fall off, and they tend to flutter to the ground. And you can often find those inside of cones if you find them before the seeds fall out or before the squirrels eat them. The male cones are much smaller. They're out right now. If you're watching this video in April, excuse me, you can hear me coughing, not because of pine pollen. Pine pollen doesn't cause too much allergies, but flowering plant pollen often does. But these cones are small and papery. They make pollen, and the pollen grains have 2 sperm inside. They blow around in the wind. They land on female cones or on your car or everywhere else, and then they fertilize the egg. And once everything's done, then you have a seed, which is this protective outer covering, the same covering we see here, as well as a little baby plant inside, the embryo. And in conifers, they actually use the female gametophyte, that little plant that made the egg that's still inside the seed. They use it for food. They're like stuck inside of it. They use it as a source of stored food until they're big enough to photosynthesize. Now, when we get to the flowering plants, we have a major evolution. This is the most diverse group of plants. They show up in the Cretaceous period and the Mesozoic. They have evolutionary relationships with insects that help them to, a lot of them get pollinated by insects rather than simply relying on the wind. But some of them do rely on the wind, like the oak trees that are in flower right now. They only have green flowers and yellow pollen everywhere, and they do not have insects to help them. And they're one of the reasons why we have allergies right now, because their pollen is tiny, it's blowing around in the wind everywhere, and it gets into our noses. But here's an example of a typical flower. There are several parts. All of them are homologous with leaves, all of these major parts anyway. So we have down here sepals, then petals, and then as we move in, we have these structures here called stamens. Stamens consist of a stalk called a filament and an anther. The anther is where pollen grains are made. Okay. In the middle of the flower is this structure called a carpel, which is basically like a rolled up leaf. And it contains 3 major parts: the stigma, style, and ovary. Stigma, style, and ovary. The ovary is this great big swollen base down here. And inside the ovary are ovules, which once again, those are the young seeds. Inside the ovule would be the female gametophyte that makes the egg. So the eggs are inside the ovules. Now what happens is pollen grains land on the stigma. That's called pollination. Then a pollen tube grows down the style into the ovary, into the ovule, and releases sperm. And that is fertilization. So don't confuse pollination with fertilization. After that, the ovule becomes a seed, and the ovary becomes a fruit. And that's where we get oranges and apples and all of that kind of stuff, is this ovary developing into a fruit. Sometimes other flower parts are involved in the fruit as well, but for the most part, it's the ovary. Okay. Inside the ovules are female gametophytes that look like this. I wanted to show you this because they're only 7 cells big. And in flowering plants, they have 2 cells that I really want you to focus on. We have an egg cell, like we would have in gymnosperms too, but we also have this great big cell here called the central cell, which contains 2 nuclei inside. two haploid nuclei, N plus N. So flowering plants have something called double fertilization. One of the sperm from the pollen grain fertilizes the egg, making the embryo. The other sperm fertilizes this cell here, and then these two nuclei all fuse together, making a triploid cell that then divides by mitosis to make a tissue called endosperm, which is food for the developing embryo. So in the conifers basically use the female gametophyte as food. This female gametophyte here is only 7 cells big. There's not enough there to feed an embryo. So they fertilize this cell, it divides into a bunch of tissue, and you've eaten a lot of endosperm in your day. That's what flour is made out of. That's what you eat when you eat rice. That's why rice is nutritious, is all that stored food in the form of endosperm. Coconut milk is endosperm. So all that stored food in the seed comes from this cell here getting fertilized and producing a triploid tissue. So in the case of a bean, you'll have all this stored food in the bean on each half of a bean. Oops. And then here is that young embryo that formed when that egg was fertilized. So when everything's done, after fertilization, you have a seed instead of an ovule. The seed has an outer seed coat, which is a protective covering. It has food storage inside for the embryo. And then you have that embryo inside, which consists of some leaves as well as a little root in there. And you can dissect a bean quite easily to see that yourself. All right. Another thing you can do in this lab is you can get some purple dead nettle flowers or other flowers, and you can peel back a piece of onion skin so it's moist and dust it with pollen. Then lay that in a petri dish with a little wet paper towel and let it sit for a while. And you might get the pollen grains to grow a pollen tube like you see here. And that's a source of potential bonus points in lab this week. You can do it at home too, but you need a microscope to see if it worked. So what happens is the onion skin tricks the pollen grain into thinking it landed on a stigma, and then the pollen tubes germinate. It's kind of cool to see. So here's a few discussion questions before we go. Starting with a spore, can you draw the basic plant life cycle? How are ferns better adapted to life on land than mosses? Where are spores made in a moss? Where are they made in a fern, a gymnosperm and an angiosperm? How are, we didn't hit it too hard on gymnosperm and angiosperm, I won't lie, but spores in gymnosperms, there's two kinds of spores, male and female, as well as angiosperms. Male spores develop into pollen. Female spores develop into that female gametophyte inside the seed in those cases. How are seed plants better adapted to terrestrial environments than ferns? That's all about how sperm gets to egg and things like that. And what is in a mature seed? What's in a seed when it's fully developed? Name all of the structures a pollen tube must pass through to reach the egg. So those are questions that you should be able to address fairly readily after completing the lab. All right, so that's a quick run through of the pre-lab for this week. I hope you got something out of it.